In November 2020, thick fog blanketed the dirt road leading into the forest of eastern Vermont as Detective Samuel Hartley stepped into a log cabin that had been abandoned for over half a century. His flashlight beam swept across torn pages and landed on a dust-covered hand Bible, and in that moment, he knew he had just touched a secret no one had ever dared to name. "Command Center, I need forensics here immediately." Hartley's voice echoed through the empty room, cold and heavy like the air that had been trapped for 70 years. What was supposed to be a routine administrative check in Vermont suddenly flung open a door back to Connecticut in 1950. The morning 9 children vanished into the mist. Right on the rotting wooden table sat a map of Connecticut, with State Street circled in red like a wound that never healed. Beneath the sawdust, they found notes that matched word for word the scrap of paper recovered from the 1950 logging truck, a coincidence too perfect to still be called chance. Every piece of evidence from Vermont fell like dominoes, unearthing buried secrets, a hidden room behind the wood paneling, narrow pine boxes, warnings to stay quiet and don't let anyone see from a man the community had once ignored. What the investigators uncovered wasn't just traces of a disappearance, it was traces of a system of control, manipulation and silence that had lasted more than 7 decades. And when the forensics, documents, and final testimonies finally clicked together, truth emerged, bigger, darker, and far more terrifying than anyone had ever imagined. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys to uncover forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The sky stayed dark longer than usual. Fog wrapped itself around the old brick houses like a silent shroud. At the end of State Street, where the long-abandoned industrial zone sat, stood a weathered wooden warehouse with walls stained by time. That was where the Mortimer family was temporarily living, almost completely cut off from the rest of the town. Locals were used to seeing a faint light glowing from the warehouse every night, but something about that morning made them take notice. Around 6, while fog still blanketed the backyard, the woman who owned the grocery store across the street saw several children standing behind the warehouse's torn curtains. They just stood there, motionless for a few seconds, then vanished from sight. That was the last time anyone in the neighborhood ever saw the kids. About an hour later, 2 young women, Martha Rivera and her cousin Lucille Rivera, showed up at the warehouse door. Both looked like they'd been through weeks of stress, exhausted but with eyes full of determination. They had come to take their children home, children they said Caleb Mortimer, owner of the warehouse and head of the household, was keeping against their will. They knocked repeatedly but no one answered. After almost 10 minutes of waiting, Martha started calling her children's names through the door crack. No response, not a single small footstep, not a cry, just the hollow echo of the cold wooden space. When Caleb finally appeared, he only opened the door wide enough to peer out, never fully, never answering any questions. He claimed the kids were resting and couldn't be disturbed right now. Martha tried to push her way in, but Caleb shut the door again. The metal latch clicked coldly into place. From behind the closed door, an argument erupted. Martha and Lucille begged, then shouted, demanding to see their children. Neighbors passing by heard the 2 women trying to stay calm while Caleb's voice dropped low and steady, impossible to make out. The air grew suffocating, tense as a wire about to snap. A few locals stopped to watch, but no one dared interfere. The warehouse door stayed shut, and the curtains where the children had appeared just hours earlier remained perfectly still. No child's shadow crossed them, no sound came from inside anymore. The unnatural silence only made Martha and Lucille more frantic. They kept pounding on the door, calling each child's name, but all they got back was cold wind whistling through the narrow corridor of the old row of buildings. The standoff dragged on for hours, as the 2 women took turns screaming and pleading with Caleb to open up. They knew something was wrong, but they couldn't prove it, and they certainly couldn't force him to let them in. Finally, exhausted and desperate, Martha grabbed Lucille's hand and they ran to the only neighbor who had a telephone. Their voices shook as they asked the operator to connect them to the North Haven Police Department. When Martha and Lucille Rivera's call reached the North Haven Police Department switchboard on that winter midday in 1950, the duty officer heard only gasping breaths and broken, panicked sentences. Yet in the initial log, the incident was classified simply as a domestic dispute. Given the social context of 1950s America, that reaction was entirely typical. Most police automatically treated arguments over children as private family matters, not emergencies. In the 1950s, the concept of missing children was not yet treated with the gravity it is today. There was no Amber Alert, no rapid response protocol, and virtually no legal standard requiring police to act immediately. When kids disappeared, it was usually chalked up to harmless explanations: playing too far from home, running away, or being taken by relatives without telling anyone. So even though Martha repeatedly stressed that she hadn't seen her children since dawn, it still didn't register as urgent to the dispatcher. A two-man patrol unit was dispatched: no sirens, no detectives. They arrived with the usual mindset: de-escalate a family conflict. When the patrol car pulled onto the deserted stretch of State Street, both officers were somewhat surprised by how distraught Martha and Lucille appeared. That surprise, however, wasn't enough to change their framing of the situation. To them, these were just two overwrought mothers. Martha recounted the morning seeing the children through the window, the argument with Caleb Mortimer, the locked door, and the unnatural prolonged silence. But the fact that the kids weren't answering or didn't come back into view wasn't treated as dangerous evidence, only as a sign the children were being kept inside by the adult in charge. The older officer even reassured her that maybe the kids are sleeping, or Mr. Mortimer doesn't want to be disturbed. In that era, a man's authority within the family was nearly absolute, and police routinely sided with the legal guardian, regardless of counterclaims. Legally, the United States in 1950 lacked the child welfare infrastructure we have today. Child services couldn't intervene without clear proof of abuse. A father or guardian locking the door and keeping children inside simply wasn't enough for officers to force entry. That was a major limitation that caused many disappearances of the era to be downplayed or mishandled. Forensic limitations further dulled police vigilance. No DNA testing, no gunshot residue kits, no standardized evidence collection protocols. Even taking statements or documenting a scene depended entirely on individual officers' diligence. In other words, even if police wanted to dig deeper, they lacked the tools to turn suspicion into solid conclusions. The patrol car stopped in front of the Mortimer warehouse. The gray wooden door remained sealed. No sound escaped. Martha and Lucille stood right beside it, looking more panicked and desperate than angry. Yet the officers stayed calm. "Let us talk to him." One stepped forward and knocked, voice flat. "Mr. Mortimer, this is the North Haven Police. We'd like to speak with you for a minute." That moment, simple, slow, and devoid of urgency, was a perfect snapshot of an era when law enforcement simply wasn't equipped to recognize the danger unfolding right in front of them. All they saw was a locked door and a family argument. None of them realized that their delay, complacency, and lack of procedure would become the starting point for one of Connecticut's longest-running and most mysterious missing persons cases. The two North Haven officers walked into the small yard leading to the Mortimer warehouse, expecting to mediate a family conflict, but the atmosphere immediately forced them to pause and look closer. Complete silence enveloped the area. They couldn't hear a single sound from inside. No footsteps, no children's voices, no furniture scraping. For a place supposedly full of young kids, that stillness was so abnormal that the officers exchanged a glance, silently acknowledging something felt off. The wooden entrance door was locked from the inside, the metal latch secured tightly, as if someone had deliberately made sure no one could get in. One officer pulled, pushed, then rammed it lightly with his shoulder to test the resistance. Still no answer. When they pressed close to the door, a damp, musty smell seeped through the cracks: old wood, dust, and the staleness of a space left unopened for too long, but mixed with something else, an indefinable odor, like disturbed fabric or belongings hastily moved. Not decomposition or blood, but definitely not the smell of a home with children present. After several unanswered calls for Caleb Mortimer, one officer suggested forcing entry. In the 1950s context, kicking in a door was considered extreme, but Martha and Lucille's account of not seeing their kids all morning, combined with the suspicious silence, gave them reasonable concern for the children's safety. One hard shoulder charge at the hinges, followed by a solid kick, and the door flew open, revealing a dark, cluttered interior. Outside light flooded the front half of the room, a makeshift living space with rolled-up mattresses leaning against walls, a few children's items scattered about, and a small table tipped sideways. But the most striking thing wasn't the mess. It was the total absence of children. No scampering away, no playful noise, no quick breathing of startled kids. Everything remained eerily quiet. One officer moved deeper inside, sweeping his flashlight along walls and floorboard. The floor showed no signs of struggle, no broken objects, no drag marks, no chaotic footprints that would suggest violence. Everything indicated only minor disturbance, as if someone had tidied in a hurry rather than fought. On one wall section there were faint smudges, not blood, but like someone had tried to wipe away dust or handprints, though not thoroughly enough for 1950s police to treat it as evidence. And then they saw him. Caleb Mortimer stood in the far corner where shadows partly hid his face. He didn't run, didn't explain, didn't look shocked to see police. His arms hung limp, eyes fixed on them but revealing no emotion. That calm stance made both officers hesitate. It wasn't the behavior of a guilty man hiding something, nor of a worried father searching for missing kids. It was simply an unreadable stillness. The officer called his name, no reply. When the question was repeated, Caleb spoke one sentence only, low but clear. "They don't want to see her." He didn't specify who her was, but he obviously meant Martha or Lucille. To 1950s police, that statement could be interpreted as an assertion of custodial rights, not a red flag of criminal behavior. They checked the remaining areas of the warehouse. Every spot only reinforced one fact: no evidence of violence, but also no evidence the children had left on their own. Beds, thin blankets, and toys were all left mid-use, as if abandoned partway through the morning. One officer picked up a small wooden doll covered in a thin layer of dust, proving it hadn't been touched for hours. Under the legal and forensic standards of 1950, nothing in the building was strong enough to escalate the case to emergency status. No bodies, no blood, no cries for help. The odd damp smell, the curtains untouched since morning, Caleb Mortimer's prolonged silence, all of it was deemed insufficient grounds for further action. After nearly an hour of looking around, asking questions, and taking notes, the two officers had to reach a conclusion consistent with their era's limitations. Situation undetermined. Children simply not present at time of inspection. In the end-of-day report, under final remarks, they wrote one brief line: "Children missing, circumstances unknown." A sentence that seemed temporary but in reality opened the abyss of a case that would stretch across 7 decades. Right after inspecting the Mortimer warehouse and finding no trace whatsoever of the 9 children, the 2 North Haven officers decided to expand the search to the surrounding area. They still considered it a family dispute, but the fact that the kids had completely vanished after several hours made it impossible for both of them to leave without checking further. No one said it out loud, but the strange silence inside the warehouse, combined with Caleb Mortimer's indifferent attitude, made them feel something was off. The first area they headed to was the lot behind the warehouse. It had once been used to store industrial materials. Now it was just gravel and patches of weeds. A cold early winter wind blew through, kicking up thin layers of dust. While sweeping their flashlights across the ground, one officer noticed several small indentations that at first glance looked like children's footprints. Light, shallow and irregular. However, the gravel surface meant the prints didn't continue in any clear direction. Each one seemed to appear and vanish on the spot, making it impossible to tell where the kids had gone or whether these were actually their footprints. As they approached the wooden fence surrounding the lot, they found something that made both of them stop. A pale blue scrap of fabric caught on the sharp top of a fence slat. On closer inspection, they recognized it as the kind of soft, frequently washed material used for children's clothing. The edge was torn horizontally, showing a sudden pull. One officer tugged gently and saw another thread still snagged on the wood, evidence that the fabric had ripped when someone or something brushed against the fence hard enough to leave a piece behind. No blood, no scratches, but in a missing children case, any item belonging to a child found in an odd place was worth noting. They carefully folded the scrap into a handkerchief, the simplest method police had back then, and marked the location on their site map. From the back lot, the search team moved to the old rail line. 2 rusted tracks ran alongside the row of industrial buildings, abandoned years earlier. The ballast stones beneath the rails didn't hold prints well, but one officer crouched down and pointed out a slight depression about half the size of a hand. It could have been made by a child's foot, or by an animal, or simply a shifted rock. Vague as it was, they marked it, because combined with the fabric scrap, any sign could turn out to be important. Right nearby, a thin branch on a bush next to the tracks had been freshly broken. The break exposed bright inner wood, proving it hadn't happened long ago. The branch hung low, at about a child's shoulder height. A light bump or a hurried dash could have caused it. It wasn't concrete evidence, but placed alongside the depression and the fabric it started to form a chain of small signals, suggesting the children might have left the warehouse area. After marking every spot around the tracks, they continued to the trailhead into the Quinnipiac woods. It was a shortcut between the industrial zone and the low forest behind it, rarely used since the paper mill shut down. Fallen leaves lay thick underfoot, forming a soft carpet that made footprints nearly impossible to find. There were a few places where leaves had been crushed, but no way to tell when. No children's clothing, no dropped items, and no sounds suggesting the kids were nearby. Quinnipiac Forest was vast, cold and full of hiding places that could swallow any trace within hours. Still, the three clues gathered from around the warehouse, the torn fabric, the small depression on the rail bed, and the freshly broken branch, when viewed together, sketched a preliminary scenario. If the children had left the warehouse, they hadn't done so freely. There were no signs of play, no overlapping footprints from multiple kids, no scattered belongings like you'd expect from a group running away or chasing each other. Instead, the traces were isolated, intermittent, and vague, as if they had left under controlled conditions, or been herded in a specific direction. Yet the police were still constrained by 1950s thinking and legal standards. There was no direct evidence of abduction, no cries for help, no signs of violence. Everything was just speculation. Although they sensed something abnormal, they lacked the tools or procedures to turn it into an official theory. They couldn't escalate the investigation to criminal status, much less order a wider area sealed off without concrete proof. Therefore, in their late afternoon report that day, the two officers wrote briefly, "Marks around the warehouse suggest the children may have left the area under unclear circumstances. Direction of departure and circumstances unknown." A conclusion just strong enough to keep searching, but not enough for police at the time to realize they were standing at the starting point of a disappearance that would haunt them for decades. After checking the back lot, the old rail line and the forest entrance without finding clear traces, the two North Haven officers decided to expand eastward toward Washington Avenue. That area had once been used for temporary parking when the paper mill was running, but since the closure it had become deserted and seldom visited. That was why the brown wooden truck parked at the edge of the lot immediately caught their attention. The truck looked old, but had been used recently. The dirt beneath the tires was lightly disturbed, the bed was still slightly warm when an officer touched it, and the rear door was ajar as if closed in a hurry. The two officers exchanged a look. The Mortimer family owned a similar wooden truck, often used to haul odds and ends during their frequent moves. Finding this truck here on the very day the children vanished forced them to examine it closely. When they lifted the rear door, late afternoon light spilled into a dark, dusty space. There were no large items, but three small objects scattered on the floor made them freeze. First was a wooden doll with faded paint and crudely drawn round eyes, the cheap kind of toy common for small children. Next to it was a dark red wool scarf with slightly frayed edges. The fabric still held some warmth, meaning someone had held or worn it not long before. Third was a folded piece of paper that fell from the edge of the bed when they opened the door fully. One officer bent down to pick up the paper. Inside were a few lines of slanted, hard-to-read handwriting that was nevertheless familiar. Caleb Mortimer. The message was short but ambiguous. "Stay quiet, don't let anyone see, wait for the right moment." The lines could mean many things, and under 1950 legal standards they couldn't yet be treated as direct evidence of a crime. But combined with the children's disappearance, it created a clear sense of unease. They continued searching the bed. No blood, no footprints, no children's clothing scattered except the scarf, but the wooden floor showed faint drag marks, as if something small had been pulled or set down. The marks were hard to see, just slight shadows on the wood, but still worth noting in the report. The front cab was unremarkable. The driver's seat was slightly depressed as if someone had just left it. The steering wheel still held a trace of warmth, and the glove box was empty. There was no registration common for old industrial vehicles, but both officers silently recognized that every small sign was gradually suggesting the truck had been used in the hours right before they arrived. Still, 1950s forensics was the biggest obstacle. No reliable fingerprinting methods, no fabric testing, no DNA. Even sealing evidence was manual. They wrapped the doll in tissue paper, placed the scarf in a cardboard box, and tucked the note into a jacket pocket to keep the wind from blowing it away. No plastic evidence bags, no way to preserve scent or fabric particles. One officer paused while looking back at the truck from a distance. If this really was Caleb's truck, and if the kids were no longer in the warehouse, could the truck be connected to their disappearance? But under the laws of the time, suspicion wasn't enough to expand the investigation. No one had seen Caleb driving it. No one had seen children in it. The toy and scarf, suggestive as they were, remained items of undetermined origin. As daylight faded, they added a short but careful line to the end-of-day report. Discovered brown wooden truck, possibly related. Children's items and handwritten note found inside. Circumstances of truck use undetermined. A placeholder entry technically correct, yet not heavy enough to shift the investigation's direction. But that truck, and the small items inside it, would later become one of the key pieces that modern forensics, decades later, would finally be able to decode. After documenting the old truck, and the children's items inside, the two North Haven officers continued expanding their search through the abandoned industrial zone. Only about 40 meters from the truck's location, they came across a warehouse that looked different from the rest. A large board covering a side door had been pulled out of place. The wood edges were fresh, and the dust around it had been wiped clean. Clear signs someone had entered around the time the children disappeared. They pushed the board aside. The interior was dark. A strong smell of old wood and dampness hit them, similar to the Mortimer warehouse but more intense. The dirt floor showed light disturbances, not chaos but straight, purposeful tracks made by one person. Both officers moved deeper in, their flashlight beams landing on a makeshift wooden partition that wasn't part of the original structure. The panel was crudely secured with a few small nails, and came off with just 2 pulls. Once removed, a narrow hidden space appeared. The room was only about 1.5 meters wide, enough for a child to stand upright, but too tight for 2 adults to turn around. Low ceiling, no escape hatch, no furniture, just a deliberately concealed dark pocket behind a thin wooden wall. 3 details immediately caught their attention. First, several scraps of children's clothing were stuffed into a crack on the left side. The pieces were small, thin, and unevenly dusty, showing they hadn't been hidden long. One officer used a stick to gently pull one out. A cheap children's shirt, buttons intact, but coated in fine wood dust, the kind that couldn't form if the clothing had been hanging naturally for years. Second was an empty wooden box against the right wall. It was just large enough to hold a small child or a big object. The box's wood was new, light-colored, with sharp edges, completely different from the old wood in the warehouse. Nothing was inside, but the bottom had faint indentations, as if something had been placed there and then hastily removed. Though its purpose couldn't be confirmed, its size and location inside a secret room made both officers realize it wasn't random. Third was fresh sawdust covering the box bottom and the floor nearby. The particles were light-colored and fine, completely unlike the gray years-old dust elsewhere in the warehouse. This showed the partition. The box or some part of it had been cut or sanded right there only days or hours earlier. In a long-shuttered industrial zone, signs of recent woodworking stood out sharp. One officer ran his flashlight along the inner wall and spotted several small horizontal scratches at child hand height. Not deep, no distinct pattern, but in the context of this disappearance, every scratch had value. However, 1950s forensics couldn't determine when or by whom they were made. Every detail in the tiny room, hastily hidden children's clothes, the new wooden box, fresh sawdust, the temporary wall painted a picture of a staging point someone had prepared to briefly hold the children before moving them. No signs of struggle, no cries for help, but each trace suggested the kids could hardly have left the area of their own free will. Yet, like every clue found from morning until now, it remained vague in the eyes of night. No blood, no bodies, no witnesses who saw the children being forced. Children's clothes stuffed in a crack couldn't be used to conclude any crime. The evidence stayed at suspicious, not enough to become a criminal charge. The 2 officers collected the fabric scraps, sketched the scene on paper. No photos, no fingerprint analysis, no proper evidence bags. They marked the location by chalking symbols on the board. then left the warehouse to keep searching elsewhere. In the end-of-day report, they wrote a short but significant line. Discovered small space containing children's clothing, wooden box, fresh sawdust, signs of recent use. Possible staging point before departure from area. That observation wasn't enough to change the investigation's direction at the time, but decades later it would become one of the keys to reconstructing the final journey of the 9 Mortimer children. When they finished searching the nearby warehouses and cataloging the vague evidence, children's clothing stuffed into wooden crevices, fresh sawdust, an empty wooden box, the 2 North Haven officers returned to question Caleb Mortimer again. The traces they had just collected proved the children had once left the warehouse, but revealed nothing about how or with whom. Caleb was the only person who could provide information, yet he was also the one making everything more complicated. When they stepped in, Caleb was still standing motionless in the dark corner, as if he hadn't moved an inch the whole time they were gone. One officer started, "Where are the kids?" Caleb answered in a flat voice, "The kids ran out back behind the factory on their own. They were always playing out there." That answer instantly contradicted everything the officers had deemed. No overlapping children's footprints, no dropped toys, no sign that a small group had either fled or been playing. When asked if someone had come to pick the children up, Caleb switched to a different story. "Maybe their relatives came and got them. I didn't notice." When the officer pointed out that he had just said the kids ran off by themselves, Caleb simply replied, "Believe whatever she wants." The blatant contradiction made the 2 officers suspicious, but in the legal context of 1950, inconsistent statements were not grounds for detention. Police had no authority to hold Caleb just because he kept changing his answer. They asked about the wooden truck found near Washington Avenue, the one containing toys and children's scarves inside. Caleb showed no surprise. "Kids leave stuff everywhere. I can't keep track." About the note, "Keep quiet, don't let anyone see," he said. "That was written to me. It's got nothing to do with anyone else." In an era before handwriting analysis or psychological profiling, a scrap of paper like that could not be used to charge anyone. When they mentioned the narrow room in the neighboring warehouse, where children's clothes had been hastily hidden in a new wooden box sat, Caleb denied everything. "That warehouse is abandoned. It's not mine." With no fingerprints, no fiber testing, no modern forensic tools for comparison, the police could not prove he was lying. Every piece of evidence they had collected was fragmentary, and could not be directly tied to Caleb under the investigative standards of the time. One officer asked him to describe the last time he saw the children. Caleb calmly replied, "They were still around here. If she didn't see them, that's not my fault." The answer made no sense, but it also broke no law. Caleb wasn't refusing to answer. He was answering in a way that gave the police nothing they could challenge. It was a common tactic among suspects of that era, neither confessing nor staying completely silent, just talking in circles enough to avoid charges. The legal limitations of the 1950s made the situation even worse. There were no child endangerment statutes like today, no mandatory medical exams, no authority to detain a guardian simply because children were missing. Police also couldn't seal off a wider area or mobilize a large search without approval from higher-ups. Approval that only came with clear signs of violence. There were no witnesses who saw the children leave. No one saw strangers in the area. No cries for help. No bodies. No blood. All the police had was a string of vague traces, a man with contradictory statements, and 9 children who had vanished completely without leaving a clear mark. After nearly an hour of questioning, the 2 officers had to admit they had reached the limits of their investigation. There was no legal basis to hold Caleb, no evidence to charge him, nothing to turn the case into a criminal file. All they could do was record the conflicting statements and continue searching the area at will. In their end-of-day report, they wrote, "No evidence to detain suspect. Children missing under undetermined circumstances. Case remains under observation." A cold conclusion and the first step toward the case, slowly sinking, moving closer to the darkness of a cold case that would last 7 decades. As the winter of 1950 passed, hope of finding the 9 Mortimer children gradually faded. In the weeks following Caleb's interrogation, North Haven police continued to conduct small, sporadic searches around the old industrial area, along the railroad tracks, the lot behind the warehouse, and the entrance to the Quinnipiac woods. But those efforts yielded no additional clear leads. The 3 initial traces, The torn scrap of fabric, the faint indentation on the gravel floor, and the hidden room behind the wooden wall, remained disconnected pieces that could not be assembled into a complete picture. No one in town saw the children again in the days that followed. Schools, churches, and hospitals all reported no children matching the descriptions. Maine HPD sent photos and descriptions to neighboring towns, but received no useful responses. A few residents thought they had seen some kids in old coats at the market or bus station, but every lead turned out to be a mistaken identity. Gradually the case, which had shaken the entire area on that foggy morning, began to sink out of sight. Meanwhile, the legal and forensic limitations of the 1950s kept the investigation almost completely stalled. There were no tools to lift fingerprints from the small room in the warehouse, no fiber analysis to determine whose clothes had been found, no dust or wood test. Even Caleb's note and the toys in the truck could not be processed in any legally meaningful way. Everything remained merely unusual signs, not evidence. Most importantly, there were no signs of violence, no blood, no broken furniture, no witnesses who heard screams. In the eyes of the law at the time, there was no reason to treat Caleb as a suspect. He was the only adult living in the warehouse, nominally considered the guardian, and that status prevented police from taking stronger action without solid ground. During this same period, Caleb Mortimer quietly vanished from North Haven in the most unobtrusive way possible. Neighbors occasionally saw him packing things up and driving the wooden truck out of the industrial area early in the morning, but no one noted the exact moment he left for good. One day the truck was simply no longer parked on Washington Avenue. The door to the warehouse where he had lived was locked, then officially sealed. When police checked, a few residents said Caleb had left Connecticut, possibly moving to an old cabin in the Vermont woods. No one verified it, and no one had reason to. As for Martha and Lucille, the mothers who had once stood at the warehouse door screaming for their children, they kept coming to the police station hoping for new information. But every time they arrived, the answer was the same: no additional leads. In an era before investigative journalism or victim advocacy movements, their cries for help drowned in community indifference. No one openly suspected Caleb, no one protested the decision to suspend the investigation. People just wanted the matter to be over, or to fade into silence. By mid-1951, after nearly half a year with no progress, NHPD made the official decision: the investigation file was temporarily closed. The Mortimer warehouse was boarded up with fresh planks, the doors nailed shut, and painted with warning. The neighboring storage buildings were locked as well, though no one monitored them regularly anymore. The already silent industrial zone grew even colder, as if covered by an extra layer of silence no one wanted to mention. The day the file was moved to NHPD storage, a small label was pasted on the cover: "Missing Children, Unresolved." Not a conclusion, not a declaration of closure. It was simply how the justice system of the time acknowledged its powerlessness. The case could not be solved with the era's tools, yet there was not enough evidence to keep investigating. And from that moment, when the file was placed at the bottom of a metal cabinet, when the Mortimer warehouse became a forgotten ruin, and when Caleb left Connecticut without a trace, the Mortimer disappearance was no longer just a search. It officially became a cold case, stepping into darkness that would last more than 7 decades. After the Mortimer disappearance file was closed at the end of 1951, the town of North Haven gradually returned to everyday life. But for Martha and Lucille, who had lost their children on that foggy morning, time did nothing to ease the pain. Throughout the 1950s, they continued coming to the police station, hoping for new information. But the answer was always the same: no additional leads. Everything the police had ever found, the torn fabric, the faint indentation, the secret room, was not enough to reopen the investigation. During the 1950s and early 1960s, sporadic searches were carried out by local patrol units, mainly rechecking the industrial area and the nearby forest. But no new traces appeared. No one saw the children, no one reported stray kids, no calls came in from other states that matched the descriptions. The absence of a central identification registry, a national database, and interstate coordination made any real tracing nearly impossible. By the mid-1960s, North Haven moved all its old files to a new administrative building. That was when some of the Mortimer evidence went missing. The wooden doll, the red wool scarf, and even the original green fabric scrap were misplaced into another box. Storage in those days was entirely manual, Clerks labeled things by feel, with no standardized sealing or cataloging procedures. As a result, by the late 1970s, when a new team tried to review old cases, they discovered the Mortimer documents and evidence scattered across 3 different locations. Each piece had been filed under a different category, making reconstruction of the case almost impossible. Meanwhile, Caleb Mortimer disappeared from the radar in the truest sense. After leaving North Haven, he was reportedly sighted here and there in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, then Vermont. Wherever he stopped, he stayed only a few months before moving on. Landlords described him as quiet, lived alone, sometimes did odd jobs with wood, but no one ever saw him with children. In that era, moving between states left little paper trail, no residency registration required, no nationwide citizen ID system, and not everyone even had a social security number. Someone who chose isolation could slip through the cracks for years without anyone noticing. Connecticut police efforts to track Caleb never went beyond exchanging handwritten letters with agencies in neighboring states. Those letters often took weeks to arrive, and replies were even slower, sometimes incomplete or lost altogether. There was no federal coordination mechanism. When the officer in charge transferred or retired, communication stopped immediately. So even though Connecticut police sent Caleb's description multiple times, no response ever placed him in connection with any other incident. By the 1970s and early 1980s, the national movement for missing children was finally gaining attention, but the Mortimer case was already too old to benefit from the new breakthroughs. There were no clear photos, no medical records, no biometric data. By the time the country started putting missing children's pictures on milk cartons, the 9 Mortimer children had become a faded story that even North Haven rarely mentioned anymore. Martha and Lucille kept asking about the case, but every visit to the station brought the same short reply, "We'll contact you if anything new comes up." But for more than 3 decades, nothing new ever did. From 1951 to 1985, the Mortimer case existed like a shadow. No progress, no suspect, no victims, no investigative direction. All that remained was an old file with a few pieces of lost evidence, and the name of a man who had vanished from mower tracking system. During that time, the Mortimer disappearance lay dormant in a filing cabinet, gradually forgotten among hundreds of other cases. It wasn't until many decades later, when modern forensics appeared and a new generation of investigators grew up with different thinking, that the case finally had a chance to step out of the dark. But for those first 34 years, from 1951 to 1985, it was simply an unsolved mystery, a true cold case. Thousands of old file boxes were moved from storage to the cold case unit for sorting, scanning and re-examination of evidence. Among them was one small, thickly dust-covered box, its label almost completely faded, "Missing Children, Unresolved." No one on the digitization team knew this was North Haven's most mysterious disappearance of night. Detective Samuel Hartley, 36, newly assigned to the cold case unit, was tasked with reviewing cases from night. The Mortimer file initially appeared as a thin folder, just a few pages of reports and virtually no forensic evidence. But as Hartley read closely, the first thing that stood out was the contradiction between the original officers' observations and their night. In the original report, the 2 officers noted no signs of violence, and children may have left on their own. Yet immediately below they listed 3 significant details: a torn piece of children's fabric caught on the fence, small indentation in the gravel near the railroad tracks, an unusual wooden panel concealing a small room in the rear warehouse. These details were completely incompatible with the theory that the children wandered off. Hartley read and reread the pages, realizing the restrained writing style of the 1950s had caused multiple critical clues to be downplayed. When cross-checking the evidence inventory, blue fabric scrap, red wool scarf, wooden doll, and handwritten note, Hartley discovered only the scarf was in the box. The other 3 items had vanished entirely. This was something he'd seen before in old cases, but with Mortimer, he had a gut feeling it wasn't just administrative loss. Hartley requested a deeper search of archives. 2 days later, a clerk located the blue fabric and wooden doll in a mislabeled box, marked 1954 lost items. The note was missing from that box, but turned up in an entirely different container under Lost Property 1950-1952, an obviously wrong location. 4 pieces of evidence from the same case, scattered across 3 separate places, was rare and highly suspicious. Hartley laid all 4 items out on the table: the torn fabric, the wool scarf, the wooden doll, and the slip of paper that read, "Keep quiet, don't let anyone see." One glance was enough. This was not a case of children running away. This was evidence of control, concealment, and deliberate movement, everything the 1950 investigation had ignored. He continued reviewing the section titled Statement of Caleb Mortimer. Another anomaly emerged. Caleb's story kept changing. He said the children ran off, then that relatives picked them up, then that he couldn't remember. Most striking, not a single page showed police ever asked him about the hidden room behind the wooden panel. No questions about the wooden truck found shortly afterward. Those gaps convinced Hartley the case had either been handled superficially or restricted by 19. What made Hartley pause longest was the note that Caleb left Connecticut immediately after the case was closed. The old report said he moved to Vermont, but there was zero supporting documentation. No change of address record, no driver's license renewal, no tax record, no local police contact. In that era, a person could vanish between states without leaving a trace. But Caleb's disappearance was so complete, it didn't feel like a normal move. Finally, reaching the last line of the 1951 report, no further action. Case unresolved. Hartley stared at it for a long time. The disconnect between the observations, the missing evidence, and Caleb's vanishing painted a very different picture. Not children wandering off, not a family dispute. This was a crime missed in the very first hours, a miss that lasted. Hartley immediately gathered the entire file, carried it to the cold case unit commander's office, set the box on the desk, and said, "The Mortimer case isn't a simple missing persons. I'm requesting we reopen it." In that moment, mid-2020, the case officially emerged from 70 years of darkness. The cold case unit's official reopening of the Mortimer case in 2020 marked the first time in 70 years that the dusty 1950 evidence was examined under modern science. Detective Samuel Hartley brought every item: the red wool scarf, the torn blue fabric, the wooden doll, and the handwritten note, to the Connecticut State Forensic Laboratory, hoping for answers the 1950s police could not find. The lab's top priority was the red wool scarf. Though faded and partially rotted, the hem still contained microscopic skin cells undetectable in the 1950s. Using modern DNA extraction, the lab obtained a clean enough profile to run comparisons. Results came back in 1 week. The DNA on the scarf matched a second great-niece of Lucille Rivera. This proved the scarf definitely belonged to one of the Mortimer victims. It was the first direct forensic confirmation that a victim had been inside Caleb Mortimer's wooden truck where the scarf was found in. The children wandered off theory collapsed immediately. If they left voluntarily, why was the scarf in Caleb's vehicle? The second item analyzed was the torn blue fabric caught on the fence near the tracks. The 1950 officers simply wrote "children's clothing." Nothing more. Under modern spectral scanning and DNA testing, the lab found faint blood traces on the fibers. DNA profiling revealed it was the blood of a child, approximately 4 years old. This evidence changed everything. At least one of the 9 children had been injured before or while leaving the warehouse. In the context of 9 children vanishing without a trace, the presence of a child's blood was something the 1950 investigators never detected. But to modern forensics, it was unmistakable. It completely ruled out the children ran away. An injured 4-year-old could not walk far without leaving more evidence. The crude wooden doll, seemingly worthless, turned out to be the most crucial piece. When analysts compared dust on the doll with sawdust collected from the hidden room behind the false panel, the match was perfect. Same wood species, same hand-planed pattern, same preservative oil typically used on 1940s-1950s coffin wood. This discovery chilled Hartley. Coffin-grade lumber was not common in regular construction or furniture. The fact that both the doll and the hidden room's paneling used this specific wood proved the room was not makeshift. It was deliberately built with specialized material. Combined with Caleb's note, "Keep quiet, don't let anyone see." The forensic picture became far darker. The 40-page forensic report, sent to the cold case unit, stated clearly, "Scarf belonged to a victim. Blue fabric contained blood of a 4-year-old child. Wooden doll and sawdust matched coffin-grade wood, indicating a purposefully prepared confinement space. False panel intentionally constructed, not child's play." When every piece was connected, every detail pointed to the same conclusion the 1950s could never reach. This was not children leaving voluntarily. This was controlled, concealed, purposeful movement. One or more children were injured. The hidden room and truck were staging points in a victim transport plan. The lab's official conclusion: high probability the Mortimer case is a homicide or pre-homicide event, not a natural disappearance. This was the biggest turning point since 1950. For 70 years the Mortimer file had been labeled "children missing, cause unknown." Now science had spoken clearly: a crime was committed, and Caleb Mortimer, the man who disappeared right after, was no longer a witness. He was the suspect. When Hartley received the report, he knew the investigation had entered a new phase, no longer searching for lost children, no longer a vague cold case. Now a full criminal investigation backed by scientific evidence that had waited 70 years to surface. After DNA and evidence analysis proved the Mortimer case could not be children wandered off, Detective Samuel Hartley moved to a decisive step, recreating the entire 1950 scene using modern 3D forensics, something the original investigators could never do. Yet the key to seeing what actually happened on the 9 children's last morning. Using USGS aerial photos, 1948-1952 property tax records, remaining foundation measurements, and the faint descriptions in the original report, the reconstruction team built an inch-perfect 3D model of the Mortimer warehouse. Front door, side door, the window where neighbors last saw the children, the dark corner where Caleb usually stood, and the exact positions of objects noted that morning. Once the model was complete, they simulated winter 1950 Connecticut sunlight and discovered that from 6:30 to 7:10 a.m., the sun shone directly through the east window, the exact time neighbors saw the children behind the curtain. After 7:10 the light moved away, leaving the interior completely dark. This proved the children did not vanish from the window. Suddenly, they simply became invisible when the light shifted, allowing the cold case unit to fix the last confirmed sighting between approximately. When simulating object positions, the team noticed a small overturned chair, a children's blanket spread on the floor, and an empty wooden crate pushed against the wall. Running movement simulations, they found those items would only end up in those positions if someone hurriedly gathered or moved the children at an adult's command, completely inconsistent with children leaving on their own. The main focus then shifted to the small hidden room behind the false wooden panel. Based on fresh sawdust fall, wood gaps and drag marks on the crate bottom, the team modeled the panel in open and closed states. When closed, a child's voice could not carry more than 45 meters. When open, light fell directly onto the crate. More importantly, the amount of fresh sawdust on the lower edge proved the panel had been opened and closed multiple times in just a few morning hours, while the drag marks showed children were placed inside in small groups, not all at once. No simulation allowed children to open the panel from the inside. When analyzing 1950 terrain, soft winter ground and typical 3 to 10-year-old behavior, the team ran escape path simulation. Every scenario produced overlapping footprints, dropped items and drag marks, especially crossing the old railroad bed. Yet 1950 officers recorded only 3 minor traces: the torn fabric, 1 small indentation, and a broken branch. The 3D model concluded those traces were consistent, only with 1 adult pulling or carrying 1 child, not 9 children moving independently. When all simulations were finished, the reconstruction team delivered a chilling but unambiguous conclusion: no plausible scenario exists in which 9 children voluntarily left the warehouse without leaving obvious traces. Every simulation requires adult intervention. Looking at the completed 3D model, the hidden room opened repeatedly, objects displaced by rushed movement, light pinpointing the final sighting, the only path matching the evidence. Hartley knew they had crossed a point of no return. The 3D reconstruction did not merely bring the past back to life. It proved that morning in 1950 was not a random disappearance, but a controlled forced removal and criminal preparation. And for the first time in 70 years, the silent Mortimer warehouse scene finally spoke. After 3D crime scene reconstruction proved that children could not have left the Mortimer warehouse on their own, Detective Samuel Hartley began searching for anyone who had direct contact with the family. In the old Rivera family records, he uncovered a name barely mentioned in prior files. Elena Rivera, who had lived briefly in the Mortimer home in the late 1940s. Now in her 70s, Elena lived in Massachusetts. When Hartley reached her, she remained silent for a long time before agreeing to meet. The conversation with Elena quickly revealed that her memories were the missing piece needed to crack the case. When asked what she remembered most clearly, Elena mentioned something that immediately caught Hartley's attention: the quiet room. When Hartley asked whether it was a real room or just a term they used, she answered firmly, "A real room, small, dark, hidden behind wooden panel. When it was closed, you couldn't hear anyone inside." This description matched perfectly with the secret room uncovered by forensics and 3D reconstruction. A narrow space concealed behind wooden walls, containing fresh sawdust and slide marks on the wooden boxes. Elena recalled that children were put in there so they wouldn't make noise, sometimes forced to sit silently for hours. "We were told God only hears silence," she said. This explained why neighbors and police in 1950 heard no cries for help, even though the children were still inside the property that morning. When Hartley asked about the large objects in the warehouse, Elena cautiously said the Mortimer house had wooden chests, the children called coffins. She clearly remembered the smell of wood preservative, the pale yellow color of the pine, and sawdust on their clothes. Forensics had already determined the dust on the doll, and inside the hidden room was coffin-grade pine sawdust from the match between Elena's childhood memories and modern scientific analysis left the team stunned. This was no longer coincidence. Elena continued that Mortimer trained the children to obey absolutely: no running, no talking, no leaving their spot unless their name was called. She remembered times when all the children were ordered to stand against the wall, hands clasped in front, eyes. This behavior perfectly matched the 3D reconstruction team's findings about interrupted movement patterns in the warehouse, overturned chairs and displaced blankets, suggesting the children had been gathered or moved on an adult's command. One of the most critical details Elena confirmed was that children were sometimes taken out of the warehouse and brought back hours later, and no one was allowed to ask where they went. When Hartley asked if she had ever ridden in the wooden truck, Elena nodded, "But we were never allowed to speak." This matched the wool scarf containing victim DNA found in the truck, physical proof the children had been transported in that vehicle. Elena was not present the morning of the 1950 disappearance, because her mother had taken her back about a week earlier. But she clearly remembered the strange behavior before she left. Mortimer moving lumber, building new walls, and putting children in the quiet room more often than usual. She said he told us big changes were coming, that God would call some souls first. Though the words sounded like religious extremism, combined with newly confirmed coffin wood, signs of forced movement, and a hidden room used repeatedly, it became increasingly clear Mortimer had planned everything in advance. At the end of the interview, Hartley asked the most important question: were the children ever allowed to go anywhere on their own? Elena immediately shook her head. Never. Not one of them was allowed to walk out the door by themselves. There was no such thing as running away. Her answer aligned perfectly with every forensic and 3D reconstruction. Conclusion: the children could not open the wall panel themselves. They could not leave the warehouse without leaving footprints. The few traces present were consistent only with adult control, and the truck was the only means of transport, exactly as she described. Leaving Elena's home, Hartley carried a 90-minute recording packed with details that matched every piece of scientific evidence he had collected. Her testimony didn't just confirm the forensic puzzle, it painted a far darker picture. Mortimer had built a years-long system of child control that was prepared, purposeful, and tightly structured. From that point, the question in the case was no longer what happened. It became, where did Caleb Mortimer take the 9 children, and how far from North Haven did he go? After Elena Rivera's testimony, describing the quiet room, small wooden coffins, and control system confirmed by both forensics and 3D reconstruction, Detective Samuel Hartley understood Mortimer had not acted impulsively. The traces in the warehouse, coffin sawdust, newly built walls, and empty wooden boxes did not appear by chance all at once. If Mortimer prepared in advance, there had to be a paper trail, stores he frequented. So Hartley spent the following weeks combing through every commercial record, tax invoice, and sales receipt from the 1950s in the North Haven, Hamden, New Haven, and Milford areas. That era had no digital data. Every transaction was handwritten, ink-stamped, stored in yellowed paper ledgers. But that very primitiveness offered opportunity. If a man like Mortimer bought materials, wood, or anything unusual, it was likely preserved in those forgotten books. The first clues surfaced in Hamden. While reviewing the ledger of Hamden Memorial Supply, a business specializing in wooden coffins and funeral supplies, Hartley found a handwritten entry dated 05/11, a small pine coffin bought with cash exactly 1 week before the disappearance. The initials CM were not spelled out, but matched how the store quickly noted unfamiliar customer. The pine wood listed matched exactly the sawdust samples recovered from the doll and hidden room, identified as coffin-grade lumber from that period. The fact Mortimer purchased a child-sized coffin in the same month as the disappearance was not just suspicious, it was the strongest evidence yet that he had been preparing weeks in advance. 2 days later, records from New Haven Gun and Tool revealed another transaction. Ammunition. 2 boxes paid cash, customer, Mortimer, Caleb. Dated 07/1950, cross-referencing purchase history showed this was the only time between 1947 and 1950 Mortimer ever bought ammunition. 2 boxes of .22 rounds, roughly 100 bullets, was not a normal amount for routine self-defense. The timing fell in the week before the children vanished. My .222 ammunition is light and relatively quiet, often chosen when discretion is needed. Alone it proved nothing, but placed beside the coffin receipt and other physical evidence, it took on entirely new meaning. The third clue appeared at Milford Lumber Co., the largest lumber yard in the region in the remaining detailed ledgers. Hartley located 4 consecutive receipts under Mortimer's. Items included thin pine planks, small nails, hinges, wood preservative, and notably 1.2-meter boards, the exact length of the boxes in the hidden room. Forensic analysis confirmed the Milford batch numbers, preservative type, and cut patterns matched the dust and fragments from the secret room. These were the very materials Elena remembered Mortimer using to build boxes, add walls, and prepare the quiet room when she was a child. When Hartley laid the 3 sets of receipts side by side, 1 child coffin on .222 ammo on 07/11, and repeated purchases of lumber, hinges, and preservative from mid-October to early November, everything became undeniable. Every item Mortimer bought matched the forensic evidence: coffin wood, preservative, hinges for movable panels, and boards matching the hidden box. All purchases occurred 46 weeks before the disappearance, exactly as Elena described, increased wall building and use of the quiet room. None of these transactions appeared in prior or later years. They were confined to a single month, the month the children vanished. An impulsive act would not produce a month-long series of lumber purchases. There would be no reason to buy a child coffin. There would be no reason to suddenly purchase .22 ammunition after 3 years of buying none. But if he had a plan, one involving control, containment, or something worse, every receipt fit the pattern perfectly. Closing the folder of receipts, Hartley could not shake the chill. Each invoice was a slice of Mortimer's cold, methodical preparation. Everything confirmed what forensics, 3D reconstruction, and Elena's testimony already showed. Mortimer prepared everything in advance. This was no longer a vague disappearance, but the outcome of a deliberate step-by-step plan. Hartley wrote one short line in his new report: an irreversible conclusion. Mortimer planned this, but if he planned it, the next question grew even larger. Where did that plan lead? After the 1950 receipts proved Mortimer prepared in advance, Detective Samuel Hartley knew the next piece had to be in the last place he lived after leaving Connecticut, Mortimer's abandoned wooden house in Vermont. It was the final location directly tied to him before he vanished from public records. With assistance from Vermont State Police, Hartley obtained a search warrant and entered the house after nearly 3 decades unoccupied. The cabin sat deep in the woods, covered in moss and falling apart, yet inside everything remained almost exactly as Mortimer left it. Desk, wooden bed, an old locked cabinet, On the desk, Hartley found an object that made the air feel heavy, a thick handmade book bound in leather cord. On the first page, Mortimer had written, "The Book of Stillness." The following pages were filled with handwritten scripture-like teachings about obedience, silence, soul cleansing, and especially one line, "Children must learn to lie still in the wooden box, to prepare for God's will." The sentence matched Elena's description of the small wooden coffins and the forensic findings about the lumber he purchased. Also on the desk was an old map of Connecticut with North Haven circled in red ink. The clearest sign Mortimer remained obsessed with State Street years later. The letters SSC written beside the circle made Hartley's skin crawl. The initials almost certainly stood for State Street Children. Beneath the map, the team found a small cloth-wrapped notebook titled Notes, November 1950, the exact month of the disappearance. Inside were the same short phrases found on the note discovered in the truck in 1950. "Keep quiet. Let no one see. Move in silence." The handwriting was an exact match to samples previously analyzed by forensic. This was the first direct link between the Connecticut truck and the Vermont cabin in 70 years. Inside the old locked cabinet, investigators found a wooden box. After forcing it open, they discovered a stack of small papers, including a list of 9 initials, matching the first letters of the 9 Rivera Mortimer children's names. That Mortimer kept this list in Vermont proved he continued to remember, perhaps track the missing children, not accidentally, but deliberately. Also in the box were miscellaneous receipts, and a scrap reading, "The Chosen Path, No Turning Back." The ink, handwriting and phrasing were identical to the note found in the truck, showing Mortimer justified his actions with the same ideology for years. Every document in the cabin, the Book of Stillness, the red-circled State Street map, the November 1950 notebook, the list of 9 initials, the dark philosophical scraps, linked perfectly to the forensic conclusions, 3D reconstruction, and Elena's testimony. Each new discovery repeated the same message. Mortimer didn't just cause the disappearance, he built a belief system, a private family cult, and a long-term structure of child control. Even after leaving Connecticut, he carried documents, maps, symbols and notes directly related to the 9 children. Leaving the Vermont cabin, Hartley knew the investigation had entered a new phase. They were no longer chasing scattered clues. They had found the mind of the perpetrator, written in his own hand. And now the question was no longer how Mortimer prepared, but where he took the children, and why. When the search of the wooden house in Vermont concluded, Detective Samuel Hartley returned to Connecticut, with a case file so thick there was no room left to insert even a single additional sheet of paper. But more importantly, for the first time in 7 decades, the Mortimer case had all 3 elements required for an arrest warrant: forensic evidence, physical proof, internal documents, ideological proof, and testimony from a surviving witness. All of it combined to form a coherent timeline with almost no gaps. Hartley's job now was no longer to find new evidence, but to assemble every fragment into one seamless sequence. From October 9, the timeline began with a series of receipts for lumber, hinges and preservative oil purchased in Milford in October and early November 1950, matching exactly the period when Mortimer reinforced the secret room and built the wooden boxes, as forensic evidence proved. Next came the receipt for a child-sized coffin on November 5, 1950, followed just 2 days later by an invoice for 2 boxes of .22 ammunition in New Haven. Taken individually, they were just isolated transactions. Placed side by side, they became a step-by-step blueprint. Immediately afterward, forensic analysis confirmed children's blood on the green cloth scrap, DNA from Rivera's granddaughter on the wool scarf inside the wooden truck, and coffin wood sawdust in the secret room. Then the 3D reconstruction recreated that November 1950 morning, proving the children could not have left the warehouse on their own, could not have opened the wooden panel themselves, and could not have crossed the railroad tracks without leaving any trace. Finally, Elena Rivera's testimony, the only surviving witness who had lived in Mortimer's house, matched every forensic detail: the silent room, the wooden coffins, the children being forced into absolute silence, and Mortimer preparing for a great change right before the disappearance. But the real turning point was the search of the Vermont house, where the team discovered the Book of Stillness, the November 1950 notebook, a map of Connecticut with State Street circled in red, and a list of 9 symbols corresponding to the 9 missing children. These documents completed the final segment of the timeline. Mortimer had not left Connecticut to forget. He took everything with him: the plan, the symbols, the beliefs, and the list of victims. When Hartley presented the entire chain of evidence to the Connecticut State Cold Case Unit's legal panel, the decision took less than 20 minutes. The arrest warrant for Caleb Mortimer was signed. His age, 97, was no longer a factor. The crime of murdering or abducting 9 children has no statute of limitations, and beyond that, the evidence showed Mortimer held extreme ideology and particularly dangerous deviant religious behavior. Even at his age, he remained a potential threat. Vermont State Police were tasked with execution. The day the warrant reached them, 3 troopers and 1 special investigator entered the small nursing home near Montpelier, where Mortimer was living, a quiet medical facility. When they walked in, Mortimer was sitting in his wheelchair, staring out the window as if nothing in the world concerned him. But when they spoke his name, one small reaction caught Hartley's attention from afar. Mortimer's eyelid twitched slightly. It was not the reaction of a confused old man, it was recognition. He did not ask why he was being arrested, he did not protest. He showed no confusion, he said only one sentence: "You're 70 years too late." That answer helped nothing legally, but it sent a chill down every investigator's spine. Mortimer was taken to Vermont State Police barracks for fingerprinting. It was mandatory procedure, but for Hartley it was also the final chance to compare against the faint print recovered from a wooden beam in Mortimer's warehouse in 1950. A print too weak for the crude technology of that era to verify. Connecticut's IFIS, Automated Fingerprint Identification System, received the data from Vermont and ran the comparison. The result came back in 18 minutes. Match. Strong confidence score. The faint fingerprint on the 1950 beam belonged to Caleb Mortimer. With this result, every last piece fell into place. Forensic proved Mortimer was at the scene. Documents showed he wrote the plan himself. The witness confirmed the control behavior. 3D reconstruction verified the children could not have left on their own. And now the fingerprint confirmed Mortimer's direct presence during preparation of the secret room. Hartley closed his final pre-arrest investigation report with one short sentence, as if shutting a door that had stayed open for 70 years. Caleb Mortimer was not merely involved, he was the only person with the authority, the means, and the motive to carry out the 1950 disappearance of 9 children. And with the arrest warrant executed, the case finally moved to the part the Rivera family had waited 70 years for, bringing Mortimer to justice. When the trial of Caleb Mortimer opened in New Haven, the entire courtroom seemed to carry the weight of 7 decades of waiting. The defendant, 97 years old, in a wheelchair, face expressionless, looked nothing like a man who once led a family cult and made 9 children vanish. But for the investigation team, this was no longer about feeling or guesswork. This was a case rebuilt with forensic evidence, data, traces left by the perpetrator's own hand. And that was exactly how the prosecution chose to conduct the trial. In her opening statement, Prosecutor Marissa Lorne delivered one short sentence powerful enough to shape everything that followed. "We will not ask you to believe a theory, we will ask you to believe science." She began with DNA, the first foundation of the case. The red wool scarf found in the wooden truck in 1950 was projected on the large screen. The forensic expert explained how DNA was extracted from the decayed fibers and announced the result: near-perfect match with Lucille Rivera's great-granddaughter, confirming the scarf belonged to one of the 9 victims. Next came the green cloth caught on the fence, dismissed as unimportant in modern DNA analysis identified blood from a roughly 4-year-old child on the fabric, something impossible to explain under the "they left on their own" theory. When asked by the prosecutor, the expert stated clearly, an injured child could not walk away without leaving footprints or dropped items. This is evidence of intervention. Once DNA laid the groundwork, the prosecution moved to tool marks and wood evidence. The expert described the distinctive yellow pine with its unique preservative oil, recovered from the secret room, and on the wooden doll. Everything matched the lumber purchased at Milford Lumber Co. According to the October and November 1950 receipts, in Mortimer's name. He explained that the match in wood grain, saw pattern, and production batch made the probability essentially 0 if done by anyone else. His conclusion rang through the courtroom: the secret room is the product of the person who bought that lumber. That person was Caleb Mortimer. After the wood evidence came the presentation that left both jury and gallery almost breathless. The 3D crime scene reconstruction. The model of the Mortimer warehouse appeared under 1950 winter morning light, from 6:45 to 7:05 a.m., the east window brightly lit, the exact moment neighbors last saw the children. Then the light moved away, leaving the interior in total darkness, matching the moment the children vanished from the window. The simulation shifted to the secret room, the wooden panel opening and closing repeatedly, the boxes showing fresh slide marks, sound suppressed beyond 5 meters. Then the model crossed the railroad tracks, an irrefutable conclusion. No scenario allowed 9 children to leave on their own, without a trail of evidence. The jury saw with their own eyes what police in that era could never have seen. When all forensic data had been presented, the prosecution moved to evidence no one had expected: the documents Mortimer left in Vermont. On screen they displayed the opening page of the Book of Stillness, Mortimer's handwritten scripture containing commandments about obedience, silence, and especially children must learn to lie still in wooden boxes, to prepare for the Holy Will. Next came the notebook labeled Notes, November 1950, with phrases identical to those found in the truck. Forensic confirmed the same handwriting: keep quiet, let no one see. The Connecticut map with State Street circled in red appeared, along with the list of 9 symbols corresponding to the 9 children. The handwriting expert confirmed every document was written by Caleb Mortimer. To tie it all together, the prosecution called Elena Rivera, the only surviving witness who had lived in the Mortimer house. She walked to the stand, white-haired and voice trembling but clear. She described the silent room, the small wooden boxes, how Mortimer taught the children never to make noise, and how he was preparing for a great change right before she left Connecticut. Everything she described matched the forensic evidence, from room dimensions to the wood panel and preservative oil. Defense counsel tried to attack her memory, but the prosecutor simply said, her testimony is accurate because the forensic evidence proves it is accurate. At this point the defense had almost nothing left to counter with. They relied only on the defendant's age, claiming he was no longer lucid and could not remember old events. But science had already answered. DNA, fingerprint, wood samples, 3D model, handwritten documents, and witness testimony all matched. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, voice firm and clear. We are unanimous. Defendant Caleb Mortimer is guilty of first-degree murder of 9 victims. The judge read the sentence. No drama, just the final truth of a 70-year-old case. He planned, executed and concealed the crime. The court finds the defendant guilty on all 9 counts. Mortimer showed no reaction, no protest, no tremor. He simply closed his eyes as if he had known this outcome for a very long time. And for Connecticut, that was the day the truth finally defeated time. When the final verdict was announced and Caleb Mortimer was found guilty on 9 counts of murder, the courtroom did not erupt in triumph. It fell silent under the weight of everything this case left behind. Beyond the fate of 9 children, beyond the Rivera families, beyond 70 years of haunting, this case became a landmark in American justice, because of the lessons it taught about investigation, about initial mistakes, and about how forensic science can resurrect a truth once thought buried forever. Looking back at 1950, the reason the case stalled was not lack of clues, but lack of tools to recognize their value. North Haven police at the time treated it as a family dispute, handled like a common civil conflict. There was no missing child alert protocol, no concept of scene preservation, no forensic ability to analyze cloth scraps, wood dust or faint fingerprints. The traces we now consider critical: children's blood, the DNA scarf, coffin sawdust, were in 1950 simply swept aside, placed in paper bags and archived in completely unmanaged storage. That lack of standards caused the entire investigation to be closed after just a few months. Closed in the most literal sense. The warehouse was sealed, evidence misfiled, reports relegated to the actual cold of a cold case locker. Yet the Mortimer case proved what modern investigators call cold case rule den 1. Physical evidence never loses value. Current technology may not yet understand it, but future science will. The cold case unit stressed that had the red wool scarf not been thrown aside, had the torn green cloth not been deemed unimportant, had the wooden boxes and sawdust not been dumped together in one bin, forensic science, 70 years later, would never have had the chance to revive the case. That is why, immediately after Mortimer's conviction, Connecticut released an internal report over 120 pages long, describing this case as the textbook example of applying modern forensic science to a historical crime. The report was sent to the FBI, the National Institute of Justice (NIJ), and cold case units nationwide. The report analyzed 3 core lessons. First, initial mistakes can doom generations of investigation. Had North Haven police in 1950 treated the warehouse as a crime scene instead of a dispute area, properly sealed it, and photographed rather than handwritten notes, the case would not have taken 70 years to solve. The Mortimer case became the classic example of misjudging the nature of a case from the start, leading to infinite delay. Second, preservation matters more than any single technique. Many items were lost forever: old wooden boxes, sections of warehouse floor, even small pieces of children's clothing. But whatever remained, however dirty, decayed, or improperly stored, was still enough for modern forensic science to extract information. If evidence still exists, forensic science can make it speak, the report stated. This single insight changed Connecticut's evidence policy. Every cold case item is now digitized, reinventoried, and preserved to new standards. Third, forensic science does not merely support investigation, it leads it. In the Mortimer case, it was not witness statements or deduction, but forensic science that connected the entire timeline. DNA proved victims were in the truck. Wood samples proved who built the secret room. 3D reconstruction proved the children could not have left on their own. Handwriting proved Mortimer wrote the notes. Receipts proved he bought the materials in the exact month of the disappearance. Forensic science became the spine of the entire case, and the trial relied on it to convict Mortimer. After the verdict, the cold case unit director told the press conference, "The Mortimer case proves one thing. No crime disappears if traces remain. Science will always find a way to let the evidence speak, whether it takes 10 years or 70. That quote became the headline on national news. In later justice conferences, the Mortimer case was added to the FBI's official training curriculum as proof that persistence, technology, and evidence preservation can carry truth across an entire generation. For the Rivera family, the verdict brought no complete joy, but it brought what they had waited for: truth backed by evidence, a conclusion not based on rumor, and acknowledgement that their children and grandchildren did not simply vanish. They were victims of a man with a plan, extreme ideology, and time to prepare. For the investigative community, the Mortimer case is a tense but necessary reminder. As long as forensic evidence exists, a crime is never truly cold. In today's America, the Caleb Mortimer case, though rooted in 1950, still carries profound warning about child safety, community responsibility, and the role of forensic science. The story shows signs that modern society must never ignore. Neighbors saw the children standing behind the curtain that final morning, then gone without a trace. They heard prolonged arguments, but believed it was just family business. It was the community's silence and police's assumption of family dispute that allowed 9 children to be taken without intervention. Today the U.S. has Amber Alerts, child protection programs, and mandatory reporting law. But the Mortimer lesson reminds us that no matter how advanced technology becomes, community vigilance remains the first line of defense. When a family lives in abnormal isolation, children are never allowed outside, or there are signs of excessive control. These are not private matters, they are red flags. The story also highlights the importance of recording and preserving even the smallest detail. Items from 1950 that seemed meaningless, a wool scarf, a scrap of cloth, sawdust, became condemning evidence thanks to modern forensic science. This reminds us that today, when incidents involving safety, harassment, or abuse are reported, even the tiniest details must be carefully documented and saved. That is not only police responsibility, but also citizens taking photos, videos, or giving timely statements. Ultimately, the Mortimer story proves that justice can arrive late, but it arrives through the combination of an alert community, accurate science, and relentless pursuit of truth. That is the core value reflecting American society's belief. Crime may evade people, but it cannot evade time and truth. If you found this story helpful in shedding light on long-buried cases, please subscribe to join us on more journeys to recover the truth. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue proving that no crime can escape the light of justice.